We are back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us. We're doing a little bit of the open phones, and we've got a little topic we're going to zero in on right now with regard to the standoff between Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C. with raising the debt limit and what it means with regard to the budget moving forward and whether or not the U.S. government's going to default and ultimately what that means to all of us if it happens. And we've heard it come close before, and we've been through this sometimes where the government shuts down for a short period of time. How serious is it this time? To join us now to talk about it is Professor John Weil from MTSU. It's good to have him on. There you are, sir. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
So let me ask you this. I mean, we've been through this time and again. It seems like every administration deals with it. There's always the threats made back and forth. It's even been a period of time where for a few weeks the government's kind of shut down. So how serious is it this time around, and what does it really mean?
You know, Congress under the Constitution is supposed to have the power of the purse, and they don't seem to be doing a very good job with it right now. You're right. We've had a couple government shutdowns in the past. This, I think, is actually maybe a little bit even more serious than that. What appears to be happening is this is being part of a negotiating ploy used for the $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan and then the $3.5 trillion that has been proposed on top of that.
Okay, so what you're saying is that in Congress, they're haggling over moving forward with that plan and getting an agreement, and part of whether or not they'll go along with some of what they're talking about there, they're going to say, look, before we do this debt ceiling and address this, we want to have some agreement here. And so it's a bargaining chip between Republicans and Democrats, and with the president, I guess, in the middle.
Right, that's part of it. And of course, the other is, I suppose, from the Republican standpoint, if they can force the Democrats to be the ones that raise the debt ceiling, then it looks like they're the big spenders. The problem with that, of course, is that, we've sort of distinguished between the money has already been appropriated. In some ways, one wonders why we even have this debt ceiling controversy, year after year. You're either going to appropriate the money or you're not. And once you do it, I don't know, if I promise that I'm going to give somebody money or pay for something, it seems odd that there would be another step saying, well, I, got to first raise my checking account before I'm able to do that. So it's a lot of political posturing going on both sides. Both have been, in my judgment, both parties have been, what was it? John McCain said he'd say they were spending like drunken sailors, but that would be to denigrate drunken sailors who maybe don't spend this much.
All right. Well, and if you would, just for those of us who aren't clear on how this whole process works, just the debt ceiling and the budget. Talk about just not specifics to this scenario here, but just how it works. All right, you're right. There's a debt ceiling in place, but why is there even debt? What we're talking about is money that's been appropriated that has to be spent for a bunch of stuff. The government has its programs and everything, and so that's based, I guess, on tax income that comes in. And of course, it doesn't always match up. So does that mean the federal government is borrowing money? And to borrow money to pay for all of this, you have to have a amount of debt that you're allowed to have. And there's a ceiling where they're saying, well, we're not going to let you ourselves borrow this much more unless we raise it. And then if you don't, then you come up short with what you have to pay out. Is that how that all works?
Basically, and unfortunately, I don't think the mechanism is working. I think by the time you get to the debt ceiling, if your goal was to cut spending or raise tax, make sure spending and taxes are relatively equal, that horse is already out of the barn. By the time this happens. And so I'm really not sure that the raising the debt ceiling or having the debt ceiling is promoting any public good, but we have it, and we go through this time after time.
We'll get into more detail, I guess, about just the infighting here, but what comes down to me, and what I think probably our viewers who are with us right now, okay, I don't really fully understand all this. Yeah, I don't like the government spending so much. The thing, but ultimately, what comes down to is if the debt ceiling isn't raised and the government shuts down, I mean, it could be devastating on a lot of fronts, and maybe you can talk about who that will impact. But what happens then is that's when it really is felt by the general public. And they're like, well, wait a second, where's my Social Security check? Or wait a second, where's this benefit? Or why is this not being taken care of? And then what they're doing is looking for someone to blame, and they're going to blame everyone in D.C., and it's not helpful for anyone's reelection efforts. So they may want to go back and forth, but ultimately, if it's not raised, all those lawmakers, for whatever reason, are going to take a shot in the chops because the public's just going to say, all I know is you guys screwed up and I'm not getting what I need.
That's exactly right. It's sort of a pox on both your houses, to use a Shakespearean term. Congress, or, every institution in our government right now, with the possible exception of the military, is at a very low level of public trust and public support. And, I'm not an expert, obviously, in markets and that kind of thing, but this kind of, uncertainty upsets the markets. Janet Yellen has said that it, could lead to a recession, maybe even a depression if it were to continue. Usually what happens is there will be sort of a last-minute rescue. Again, Republicans want to seem to make, want to have the Democrats take full responsibility for this. Democrats, in turn, are saying, well, most of the debt that we're dealing with right now was actually racked up during the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, they go back and forth on this. What kind of services, by the way, would just the average general public notice going away if indeed, they don't get this going and the government shuts down, just tangibly on a day-to-day basis? What will people notice?
Well, I think you're right about the Social Security. A lot of people are dependent on that. The people that would be most severely hit, of course, would be what are known as unessential governmental services. Even in a shutdown in the past, you can't close the military up. There are certain basic things that are, I would assume public safety kind of things are going to have to continue. But it would have a tremendous ripple effect across the economy.
Yeah, or I would think just tangibly about when you say non-essential. For instance, I would think that the Smithsonian Institution, all those museums there on the mall in D.C. would just close. They'd have to close.
National parks.
All those,
right.
Yeah, all the parks. The federal parks, Smoky Mountains, all that. I mean, they're going to shut because they will not be staffed.
Yeah, non-essential services are sort of like minor surgery, that there's something that affects somebody else.
Yeah, exactly.
And most, if you plan for 6 months to go to a national park, well, that seems pretty essential. You've built your life around it. But you're right, some of those, many of those would end up closing.
So, you hear a lot of name calling back and forth. I mean, the president is calling Republicans hypocritical and dangerous and disgraceful for the way they're handling it. Mitch McConnell says, no, this is just on, Biden. I mean, how do we think this will work out? Because I think this is just an acute moment here dealing with, the debt ceiling and getting the budget going. But the big picture here is, Biden's stimulus plan and, infrastructure thing. That's a huge thing, especially for the Democrats. And, it sounds to me like they're going to have no choice but to really kind of scale back the sheer size and scope on that if they're going to get any Republicans to go on board.
Well, and of course, it partly depends on whether they suspend the filibuster or not. There's as many fissions within the Democratic Party right now as there are between the Democratic and Republican Party. Will Rogers once said that he didn't belong to an organized political party. He was a Democrat. And there's been, tremendous, particularly with Joe Manchin, the Arizona senator right now, who have been, saying from the beginning, we're not going to go with 3.5, maybe we'll go for 1.5, maybe we'll go for 2.0. But, there's actually two bills. There's another, 1.5 infrastructure bill, 1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. And the irony there is this has been a proposal by both Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
You may remember Trump at one point said he was going to have an infrastructure week or an infrastructure month, and they ended up getting sidelined on something else. But you would think for that 1.5 trillion, that there would be, you know, that there really is relative consensus. And I guess, you know, I'm not sure why. Well, that's been linked then to this much larger package. A lot better chance for the first to go through than for the second.
Right. All right. Listen, we'll take a break. When we come back, maybe we can spin out of this to some degree how, you know, all of it's attached to politics one way or the other. And, you know, one way or the other, it's not going to be too long before we have another presidential race, you know, and, you know, people posturing and positioning and, you know, what this all means and how, you know, it's very close, obviously, in the Senate. It's close and, you know, who knows what's going to happen in the House. I mean, we'll talk about how all this plays against the upcoming political landscape with our professor right after this. Stay with us.
This is a Storm 5